Harry Truman walked into his first meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was 11 a.m., less than 24 hours after Franklin Roosevelt's death. Truman had been vice president for exactly 82 days. Now he was president of the United States. The Joint Chiefs assumed the new president understood the military situation. They assumed wrong. General George Marshall began discussing troop dispositions in the Pacific. He referenced plans Truman had never seen. Admiral Ernest King mentioned naval operations Truman didn't know existed. General Henry Arnold discussed strategic bombing campaigns Truman had never been briefed on. When they finished, the room fell silent. Marshall, King, Arnold, these were the men who had won the war. They had worked together for years. They knew every detail of every operation. And now they were looking at Harry Truman, looking at the man from Missouri who had spent the war presiding over the Senate. The realization hit them all at once. They would have to explain the world to him. Truman sat there, absorbing their shock. He understood something terrifying. He was now responsible for ending the largest war in human history, and he had no idea what was happening. Harry Truman's exclusion wasn't normal. Past vice presidents who suddenly became president had been better prepared. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 when William McKinley was assassinated. McKinley had kept Roosevelt more involved than most vice presidents. Calvin Coolidge became president in 1923 when Warren Harding died suddenly. Coolidge had been the first vice president to regularly attend cabinet meetings. This was a new practice Harding had started in 1921. Franklin Roosevelt systematically dismantled this tradition of inclusion. He excluded Truman from everything. The question wasn't what Truman knew. The question was what he didn't know. And the answer was almost everything that mattered. January 20th, 1945. Harry Truman was sworn in as vice president during Roosevelt's fourth inauguration. The ceremony was brief. Roosevelt was too sick for the traditional celebration. Truman's main constitutional duty as VP was presiding over the Senate. That's where he spent most of the next 82 days. Not in strategy meetings, not in cabinet sessions. In the Senate chamber, managing floor debates. Truman tried to get briefed by the War Department. He was told the president would inform him when necessary. He asked the State Department for updates on negotiations with Churchill and Stalin. They said to check with the White House. He requested meetings with Roosevelt's chief of staff. The meetings kept getting postponed. The pattern was clear. Roosevelt's inner circle didn't think Truman needed to know anything. They treated the vice president like a ceremonial figurehead, not like someone who might need to take over at any moment. And everyone knew Roosevelt was dying. By early 1945, Franklin Roosevelt's health was visibly collapsing. He had lost weight dramatically. His hands shook. His face was gaunt. Reporters who saw him were shocked by his appearance. The White House staff knew the president was dying. The Secret Service knew. Cabinet members knew. Even foreign leaders noticed. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Churchill and Stalin were both disturbed by Roosevelt's physical condition. The president could barely stay focused during meetings. His memory was failing. He repeated himself. It was a conspiracy of silence. A collective act of denial fueled by misplaced loyalty to a dying titan. And underneath that loyalty was a deep, unspoken fear of the man from Missouri. Despite everyone knowing Roosevelt might die at any moment, No one was preparing Truman to take over. The vice president wasn't even told what happened at Yalta. Roosevelt returned from the conference in February. Truman tried to get a briefing. Roosevelt was too tired to see him. Maybe next week. Next week never came. Roosevelt left for Warm Springs in late March to rest. He never returned to Washington alive. During the entire 82 days as vice president, Harry Truman had barely a handful of significant interactions with Franklin Roosevelt. Historical records suggest only one or two truly private meetings, not counting large cabinet meetings or ceremonial events, just one or two substantial conversations. The most notable meeting was on March 19, 1945. It lasted about an hour. They discussed administrative matters. Roosevelt was cordial but distant. Nothing about war strategy, nothing about diplomatic agreements, nothing about major policy decisions. Any other interactions were brief and superficial. Roosevelt seemed distracted and exhausted. He told Truman everything was going well. The war in Europe would be over soon. That was it. That was the sum total of Truman's preparation to be president. Perhaps 2 hours of meaningful conversation over 82 days. While Roosevelt made decisions that would shape the post-war world, Truman left both meetings frustrated. He knew something was wrong. The President of the United States was dying. The Vice President should be getting prepared. But Roosevelt wasn't preparing him, and Roosevelt's staff was actively blocking Truman from getting information. On April 13, 1945, when Harry Truman became president, he was effectively a commander-in-chief in name only. He was ignorant of the troop strengths, naval dispositions, and secret air campaign strategies that were, at that very moment, deciding the fate of the Pacific. He didn't know the plans for invading Japan. He had never been briefed on the casualty estimates that would guide the most critical decision of the war. The gaps in Truman's military knowledge were catastrophic. Any one of these could have led to disastrous decisions. He was commanding a global war machine he didn't understand. Truman's first week as president was a humiliating education in how thoroughly he had been excluded. Military briefings assumed he knew things he didn't. When he asked basic questions, generals looked surprised. They had assumed the vice president was being kept informed. Harry Truman was a man of immense pride. He had clawed his way up from a failed hat shop to the United States Senate. Now he was sitting in the Oval Office, asking briefing officers to explain maps that had been on Roosevelt's desk for months. The burning humiliation was almost physical. Cabinet members started explaining policies. They referenced decisions Roosevelt had made. Truman had to interrupt to ask what those decisions were. The cabinet members were shocked. The State Department brought him diplomatic cables. They assumed he understood the background. Truman had to read months of correspondence just to understand what was happening. He was learning American foreign policy from scratch while trying to run the country. The worst moments came when allies and adversaries tested the new president. Churchill sent complex messages about Soviet intentions. Truman had to admit he didn't know what Roosevelt had promised Churchill. Stalin sent diplomatic notes referencing Roosevelt's secret diplomacy. Truman didn't know the details of those commitments either. Foreign leaders realized the new American president knew nothing. They started maneuvering to take advantage. The people closest to Franklin Roosevelt had protected him by keeping Truman in the dark. But the exclusion wasn't driven by any single advisor. It came from Roosevelt's personal management style. He compartmentalized everything. He trusted very few people with complete information. Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, controlled access. James Burns managed political relationships. Harry Hopkins handled diplomatic missions. Each knew their piece. None saw the whole picture. And none thought the vice president needed to be included. They believed Roosevelt would survive long enough to see the war through. They would handle the details. Briefing Truman seemed unnecessary. That calculation was catastrophically wrong. Roosevelt died 82 days after Truman became vice president. The inner circle suddenly had to brief a president who knew nothing, but they didn't want to admit they had failed to prepare him. The question haunted Truman for the rest of his life. Why did Roosevelt keep him in the dark? The most charitable explanation was exhaustion. Roosevelt was dying. Every meeting drained him. Every briefing took energy he didn't have. Including Truman in decisions would have required explanations and discussions. Roosevelt didn't have the strength. A less charitable explanation cut deeper. Franklin Roosevelt was famous for his charm. He could make a complete stranger feel like his best friend. Politicians left meetings with Roosevelt feeling valued and important. Yet Roosevelt treated his own vice president like a ghost in the hallway. The coldness was deliberate. The party bosses had forced Truman onto the ticket. Roosevelt hadn't chosen him. Roosevelt had wanted Henry Wallace to remain as vice president. Maybe Roosevelt resented having Truman as VP. Maybe he excluded Truman as punishment for replacing his preferred successor. The darkest explanation was that Roosevelt never accepted he was dying. He believed he would survive to see victory. He would have time to brief Truman later, or maybe he would run for a fifth term. The succession question didn't matter because there wouldn't be a succession. Whatever Roosevelt's reasoning, the result was catastrophic. He had created a situation where American leadership could collapse at any moment. And on April 12, 1945, it nearly did. April 25, 1945. 13 days after becoming president, Secretary of War Henry Stimson requested a comprehensive briefing with Truman. This wasn't their first discussion about the secret weapon. On the night of April 12th, hours after Truman was sworn in, Stimson had pulled him aside briefly. He had mentioned an immense project, a highly secret explosive. But the moment had been chaotic. Truman was meeting the entire cabinet. Stimson's mention was cryptic and rushed. Now, 13 days later, Stimson was ready to explain everything. Truman sat down expecting important war news. What he got was something far bigger. The United States had been running a program for 3 years. A program so classified that only a handful of people knew it existed. The program was building a weapon unlike anything in human history, an atomic bomb. Truman sat in stunned silence as Stimson explained the full scope. Nearly $2 billion had been spent. 130,000 workers were employed. Entire secret cities had been built in Tennessee and Washington state. Massive industrial facilities had been constructed. The weapon was nearly complete. It would be ready for testing within months. When Stimson finished speaking, something fundamental had changed. The world Truman thought he lived in was gone. A world of tanks and ships. A world where wars were won by industrial production and military strategy. That world had ended. Now Truman was the only man on Earth with the power of a god. given the keys with no instruction manual. A cold chill ran through him. Truman asked the obvious question. Why had no one told him? Stimson explained that Roosevelt had kept the Manhattan Project compartmentalized to prevent leaks to Germany or Japan. Only people with absolute need to know had been briefed. Roosevelt had decided the vice president didn't need to know. Truman absorbed this information. Despite that cryptic warning from Stimson on his first night, it took 13 more days for the President of the United States to be told his country possessed the power to destroy cities with a single bomb. This was the moment Truman understood the full catastrophe of the 82 days. He hadn't just been kept out of meetings, he had been kept ignorant of the most powerful weapon ever created. The Manhattan Project wasn't the only massive secret Roosevelt had kept from his vice president. Truman discovered intelligence reports were beginning to suggest Soviet espionage operations inside the American government. The full extent wouldn't become clear for years. But warning signs existed that Roosevelt's people hadn't shared. Truman discovered the full extent of secret agreements with Stalin about the Far East. Roosevelt had promised the Soviets control over territory in China and Japan. The Chinese government hadn't been consulted. This too had been hidden from the man who was one heartbeat away from the presidency. Truman discovered ongoing code-breaking operations. The Allies had been reading German and Japanese encrypted communications for years, ultra and magic programs, operations that had shaped every major battle. It was another shadow Truman was left to stumble through. Truman discovered economic plans for post-war reconstruction, massive lending programs, international institutions being created, the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, decisions that would reshape the global economy. No one had thought to brief the vice president. Each discovery deepened Truman's fury. Roosevelt hadn't just excluded him from one secret. Roosevelt had excluded him from everything that mattered. Truman made a decision in late April 1945. He would never trust Roosevelt's inner circle. They had failed to prepare him. They had protected Roosevelt by keeping the vice president ignorant. That failure endangered the country. It couldn't be allowed to continue. Over the next 18 months, Truman systematically replaced Roosevelt's cabinet with his own team. Critics called it a purge. Truman called it building an administration that worked for him. But it was more than that. It was an act of survival. Truman wasn't just firing people. He was killing the ghost of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Truman realized that to lead, he had to stop being Roosevelt's accidental successor and start being the president in his own right. As long as Roosevelt's men controlled the government, Truman would remain what they saw him as, a placeholder who never should have been there. The transitions were gradual. Each departure had its own cause. Edward Stettinius' estate was replaced with James Burns in July 1945. Truman wanted his own man handling Soviet relations. Henry Wallace at Commerce lasted longer. But by September 1946, Truman fired him for publicly attacking administration foreign policy. Each departure brought in someone loyal to Truman. People who understood that the president needed complete information, not selective briefings filtered through advisors' biases. He had learned the lesson Roosevelt's death had taught. A president must control his own information. He must build his own team. He cannot rely on inherited advisors who serve a dead man's memory. The Manhattan Project secret became Truman's defining moment, the revelation that proved how catastrophic Roosevelt's secrecy had been. If Roosevelt could keep the atomic bomb secret from his vice president, he could keep anything secret. And he had. The 82 days Harry Truman spent as Franklin Roosevelt's vice president changed how America handles presidential transitions. The National Security Act of 1947 was the specific legislative response. It created the National Security Council to ensure the vice president would be included by law. Every president since has been reminded of Truman's experience. Vice presidents now attend NSC meetings. They receive regular intelligence updates. They know the nuclear command protocols. They understand classified programs. The institutional memory of Truman's 82 days in the dark prevents future catastrophes. When a vice president becomes president, they understand the basic framework of government. They know the major policies. They have relationships with key advisors. Roosevelt's failure to prepare Truman could have cost America the war or the peace that followed. A president making decisions about atomic weapons and Soviet expansion needed complete information. Truman got that information 13 days late. The country was lucky nothing catastrophic happened in those 13 days. Truman's 82 days were a near miss for democracy. The safety of the world rested on whether two people in one building were actually speaking to each other. They weren't speaking, and the world nearly paid the price. The lesson remains critical. Succession can happen at any moment. The next president must be prepared. Keeping a vice president in the dark isn't protecting the president, it's endangering the country.